Welcome to a tale where art and the supernatural collide. The painting that changed overnight is more than just a story, it's an unsettling journey into the unknown, where a cursed painting brings something ancient and terrifying into thralled. Follow Sarah, a young artist who, after discovering an enigmatic painting of a stormy woman, finds herself tangled in a curse that twists reality itself. As the painting changes and the figure inside it begins to emerge, Sarah is faced with a choice: destroy the painting or risk unleashing an unimaginable darkness. Stay tuned as we unravel the mystery of the painting that changed overnight. It was a rainy afternoon when Sarah first stumbled upon the art store. She had been walking aimlessly through the city, seeking solace in thievery skies and the sound of raindrops tapping against her umbrella. The soft, rhythmic patter of rain always had a calming effect on her mind, which had been clouded with worries for the past few weeks. Work at the gallery had been slow, and the struggle to find her next project as an artist weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets as she wandered through the old part of town. Buildings here standing as monuments to a time long past. Everything was familiar, yet it felt distant, as though she was walking through a forgotten dream. And then she saw it, a small, hidden storefront tucked between two taller buildings, almost invisible to passers-by. Its windows were fogged with age, and the door, painted a faded red, was barely cracked open. Above it, a sign read simply, "Desmarais Art Store." The name caught her eye, stirring something deep within her. She didn't know what compelled her to enter. Perhaps it was the strange pull of the place, or perhaps it was the promise of finding something she could hold on to in her otherwise unsteady world. Either way, she found herself standing in front of the door, pushing it open with a soft creak theme. She stepped inside. Sarah was enveloped by a musty, old smell, the kind that clung to every corner of Therum like dust. It was a small store, dimly lit, with narrow aisles crammed with canvases, frames, and sculptures. Old art supplies lined the walls, and faded paintings leaned against every available surface. The space felt ancient, as if time had stood still, here, waiting for someone to rediscover it. A bell above the door jingled faintly as Sarah made her way deeper into the store felt like a time capsule, preserved in perfect silence, with only the sound of her soft footsteps breaking the stillness. There was no one in sight. The place seemed deserted, as if its owner had disappeared long ago. Sarah wandered through the aisles, glancing at the paintings on the walls. They were all portraits, old, weathered, and somewhat strange. Most of them depicted lonely figures, staring out with solemn eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved. Each one felt imbued with emotion, a heavy, almost unsettling presence that in the air. It wasn't until she reached the back corner of the store that she saw it. Against the wall, partly hidden behind a stack of old canvas rolls, was a painting. It was an oil painting, framed in dark wood, and the brushstrokes were thick and textured. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary portrait of a woman standing in a stormy landscape. The woman's face was pale and sorrowful, her long hair whipping around her in the wind. Her expression was haunting, full of deep emotion, as though she was staring out at the viewer with a secret she could never reveal. But what caught Sarah's attention was the atmosphere of the painting. It was alive in a way that no other artwork had ever felt to her. The colors seemed to move with the changing light in the room, and the woman's eyes, the more Sarah looked, the more she felt as though they were staring back at her, pleading for something. Without even thinking, Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the canvas. The paint was thick, the texture rough under her fingertips. There was a strange, almost magnetic pull to it, like the painting was calling to her. She didn't know why, but she had to have it. It was as if the painting had chosen her. Thepple was undeniable, almost overwhelming. She could feel a sense of urgency growing inside her, as though the painting was waiting for her to bring it home. Just then, the sound of footsteps broke her trance. Sarah turned around quickly to see an old man standing at the front of shop. His clothing was simple, worn, but his eyes gleamed with a strange knowings. "Ah, I see you've found it," he said, his voice soft and gravelly, as if it hadn't been used in years. "The painting of the Storm Woman," Sarah nodded, still staring at the painting. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice almost breathless. The old man smiled faintly, stepping forward. "It's much more than that," he replied. "It's been waiting for someone like you." Sarah's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, it's just a painting?" The man's gaze grew distant, as if lost in a memory. "That painting was created by Victor Desmarais, a gifted artist, but also a man with a troubled past. He painted her long ago, his wife, who vanished without a trace. Some say he painted her after she disappeared, to keep her alive in his mind. Others believe it's more than that. But I can tell you this, that painting is special. It has its own story to tell." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as the man's words sank in. The painting wasn't just beautiful. It was imbued with something deeper, something darker. "The Storm Woman," the Mon continued, his voice growing faint, "is no ordinary portrait. She has a way of changing, of revealing things. Things that are not always visible at first." Sarah turned back to the painting, her heart racing. She didn't understand what he meant, but something in his words unsettled her. And yet, the pull of the painting, the desire to own it, grew stronger. "How much is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The old man seemed to hesitate before responding. "For you, a fair price. But remember, once it's in your hands, it will never let you go." Sarah didn't know why, but she found herself agreeing. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though she needed this painting, needed to understand it. She handed over the money, and the Mon wrapped the painting carefully. As Sarah left the shop, she glanced back one last time, and for a moment, she thought she saw the woman in the painting move. But when she blinked, the figure was still. Sarah could barely contain her excitement as she walked home from Theth's store, the painting carefully wrapped in brown paper and tucked under her arm. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a soft, misty haze that seemed to make the city feel quieter, as though everything was waiting for something. The weight of the painting felt different from what she expected. It wasn't heavy in the physical sense, but there was a strange presence to it, like it was more than just a piece of art. Sarah couldn't explain it, but there was a magnetic quality to the painting, a pull she couldn't ignore as she entered her apartment. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. She placed the painting on the easel in the middle of her small studio and carefully unwrapped it. Her eyes lingered on the figure of the woman, the Storm Woman, as the old man had called her. The painting's colors were deep and vibrant, with rich tones of gray, blue, and muted gold. The woman's face was haunting, her eyes holding an expression that was both sorrowful and pleading, as if trapped in a storm both inside and out. She ran her fingers over the frame, still mesmerized by its pull. "What are you?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Thea in the room seemed to thicken, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. For the rest of the evening, Sarah worked on her own art, trying to push the painting from her mind. But the image of the woman kept creeping back into her thoughts. She couldn't help but feel like there was something more to it, something deeper beneath the surface. That night, Sarah placed the painting against the far wall of the studio, dimming theolights and heading to bed. As she lay there, the gentle hum of the city outside her window lulling her into a restless sleep. She couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted, something was different. She awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft creaking, like something was moving. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting an eerie glow across the room, illuminating the painting. Her eyes immediately darted to the storm woman, her face still set in sorrow, but something had changed at first. Sarah thought it was just her imagination, the shadows playing tricks on her. But as she squinted, she saw it clearly. The woman's expression had subtly shifted. Her lips, which had once been tightly pressed together, were now slightly parted, as if she were about to speak. And her eyes, they were darker, more intense, as though they were staring directly at Sarah, piercing through the space between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She climbed out of bed, walking cautiously toward the painting. As she approached it, the room seemed to grow colder. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up and her pulse quicken. The painting was different. She could feel it, like a subtle shift in the air. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just above the surface of the canvas. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her every movement, the sorrow in her face deepening, as if the painting was alive, watching her, waiting for something. Sarah shook her head, dismissing the thought. She had spent the day immersed in her own work, and perhaps the late hours and her overactive imagination were playing tricks on her. It was just a painting. She needed to get some sleep, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stepped back, her eyes lingering on the portrait one last time. The room had become unnaturally cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, twisting like living things. Reluctantly, Sarah turned off the studio lights and went back to bed. The last thing she saw before drifting into a fitful sleep was the painting, still staring back at her, its eyes darker, its expression more intense. The next morning, Sarah awoke, late, her mind foggy and her body aching from the restless night. She hadn't wanted to look at the painting again, but something inside her urged her to do so. As she stepped into her studio, she felt a knot form in her stomach. The storm woman was still there, but now the changes were more pronounced. The eyes had deepened further, their intensity almost unnerving. The woman's face, while still holding the sadness, seemed to carry a new sense of urgency, as if she were trying to communicate something to Sarah. Sarah stepped closer, her heart thudding in her chest. This wasn't just a shift in expression, it felt like the painting was evolving in real time, like it was adapting. She couldn't quite explain it, but she could feel it deep in her bones. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing the surface of the canvas. A jolt of cold rushed through her hand, and she pulled back, startled. Her mind raced. Was this real? Had she just imagined it? No, she had definitely felt something. "Okay, Sarah, get a grip," she muttered to herself. "It's just a painting. It's a trick of the light." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She spent the day in a daze, trying to distract herself with other projects, but her mind kept returning to the painting. Their changes, the sensation of coldness, the eunice that had settled in her chest. That night, as the storm outside raged, Sarah found herself back in front of the painting, unable to resist. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the moonlight reflecting off the canvas. The storm outside howled against the windows, sending gusts of wind that rattled the glass. But as Sarah stared at the painting, something happened. The woman's eyes, they moved. Their figure in their painting blinked for a split second. Sarah thought she might have imagined it, but then the eyes blinked again, slowly, methodically. A deep shiver ran down her spine as she took a step back. This storm woman had come to life. For the next few days, Sarah couldn't escape the painting. It was impossible to ignore the subtle shifts she kept noticing. She had tried to distract herself, to convince herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something was happening, something that didn't make sense. Every time she looked at the storm woman, the changes were more pronounced. The woman's expression, which had initially been one of sadness, now seemed to carry something else, something darker. There was an unmistakable tension in her face, an underlying fear that hadn't been there before. Her eyes no longer seemed simply sorrowful, but filled with panic and an unsettling knowledge, as if she was aware of something happening in the world outside the canvas. Sarah couldn't tear herself away. Her fingers itched to get closer to the painting, to understand what it was trying to tell her. But every time she did, it felt as though the figure in Thepatrea was staring directly into her soul. Reading her, knowing her deepest fears, Thepatena was no longer just an object. It was an obsession. Sarah found herself unable to work on anything else. Her attention consumed by the portrait that had changed, night after night, since she brought it home. But it wasn't just her perception of the painting that was changing. The room around it seemed to shift, too. The air in the studio grew heavier. The temperature fluctuated, sometimes growing unnervingly cold, then suddenly warmer. The light from the window, which usually bathed her studio in a soft glow, now felt harsh, flickering, almost as if the room itself was alive, reacting to the painting. One evening, after a particularly long day of staring at the portrait, Sarah felt the need to take a step back. She hadn't eaten much, hadn't slept, and was beginning to feel the weight of the strange atmosphere pressing in on her. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved away from the painting, but as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She walked across the room, trying to focus on anything other than the portrait, but her eyes kept darting back to it. It was as if the painting was calling to her, beckoning her to come closer. And then it happened. The change was subtle at first, so slight she thought she might be imagining it. But the longer she stared, the more she was sure of what she saw. The woman's hands, which had always been calmly folded at her sides, were now raised, as though reaching out toward Sarah. The tips of her fingers pressed against the surface of the canvas, leaving faint white streaks that made it appear as though the woman was slowly trying to escape. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine, and her breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the movement. The figure in the painting wasn't static anymore. It was alive, shifting, evolving in ways that made her skin crawl. Her lips, once closed in quiet despair, now parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but there was no sound. Sarah's pulse quickened as she stepped closer to the painting, her hand instinctively reaching out toward it. The air around the portrait felt thick and charged with energy. Her fingers brushed the canvas, and a sharp, electric jolt shot through her hand. It wasn't just the painting. It felt real. She pulled back, heart racing, her breath shallow. She wanted to run, to escape the room and the painting, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Something inside her urged her to stay, to confront whatever was happening to the painting, to unravel its mystery. But fear twisted in her stomach, and her mind screamed for her to leave. This isn't normal, she thought. This isn't just art. This is something else. Her eyes never left the portrait as she slowly backed away, trying to distance herself from the painting's hypnotic gaze. But the woman's eyes followed her, those dark, pleading eyes that seemed to beg for something. They seemed to recognize her now, as if they were reaching out to her, drawing her in. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the storm woman flashed before her. Her eyes growing darker, her fingers moving just a little more, inching closer to escape. The fear that had been growing inside Sarah all day came to a head, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer safe in her own apartment. The following day, Sarah's obsession with the painting grew worse. She avoided it for a while, trying to focus on her work, but every time she passed by her studio, the pull was too strong. She couldn't help it. She had to go back, and each time she did, the painting had changed just a little more. Now, the woman's eyes no longer simply followed her. They seemed to search for her, as though she was waiting for Sarah to notice. The woman's lips had started to curl into a faint, unnerving smile. But it wasn't a comforting smile, it was something darker, as though she was sharing in Sarah's fear. As Sarah stared at the portrait that night, she noticed something new. Something that made her blood run cold. The background of the painting, once a stormy sky, was now filled with shadowy figures, hovering just out of focus. Their outlines were unclear, but their presence was unmistakable. They were watching her too. Sarah's eyes flicked back to the woman's face, and her breath caught in her throat. The woman's smile had widened, and Sarah could now see that her hands, no longer reaching out, were now pressing against the surface of the canvas. Thepent around her fingertips seemed to shift and ripple, as if she was trying to break free from the confines of the painting. This is no longer just a painting, Sarah thought, a sickening realization filling her chest. It's alive. With a gasp, Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing. She reached out for her phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably, desperate to make sense of what was happening. But her fingers froze on the screen. There was no time to search for answers. The woman in the painting had crossed the threshold of what was once a simple portrait. She was no longer just an image. She was real, and she was coming closer. The studio was suffocating. The painting was no longer just a part of the room. It was the room, the very air around it thickening, swirling. The shadows behind the woman in the painting seemed to pulse, moving closer to the edges of the canvas. Sarah backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears, but she couldn't stop herself from looking at the painting. The woman's eyes were no longer pleading, they were commanding, and Sarah realized, with growing horror, that she had just become a part of the painting's story, and there was no turning back now. The storm came without warning, the wind howling through the narrow streets of the city, bending trees and rattling windows. The thunder rumbled in the distance, steadily growing louder, until it seemed to shake the very foundations of Sarah's apartment. Sarah stood at the window, watching the dark clouds roll in, the sky shifting from a dull grey to a deep, threatening black. The rain began to pour in torrents, slashing against the window with a violent intensity. It was a storm unlike any other she had seen before, the kind that carried with it a sense of foreboding, as though something was about to break. The room was cold. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the chill in the air seemed to cling to Sarah's skin as she stood there, unable to look away from the storm. Something about it felt familiar, as though it was connected to the strange events of the past few days. She turned toward her studio, feeling an odd pull toward the painting, as though the storm was calling to it, calling to her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she knew she couldn't ignore the painting any longer. She had tried to avoid it, tried to focus on other things, but now the room seemed to draw her in, as if the storm outside was part of something much larger, something darker. Stepping into the studio, she found the air thick with an unnatural heaviness. The temperature had dropped again, colder than it should have been for a late spring evening. Sarah shivered, but it wasn't just from the chill. The room felt alive, as if something was moving within it, breathing in the shadows. And there, in the corner of the room, the painting stood. The storm woman's face, once sorrowful, now seemed twisted in agony. Her lips were parted, and her eyes, those dark, haunting eyes, were wide, as if they were about to scream. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling with an eerie intensity. Sarah's breath quickened as she looked at the painting. Figure seemed to shift. Her body was no longer still, but as if caught in a violent gust of wind. Her hair, once flowing passively around her face, now whipped through the air, moving like it was caught in the tempest that raged outside. The painting was no longer just a portrait, it was a living thing. The colors began to swirl in a way that made the woman look as though she was breathing, her chest rising and falling, her face contorting in pain. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. Sarah gasped, her breath turning to mist in the cold air. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and a flash of lightning illuminated the room for a brief, terrifying moment. And in that instant, Sarah saw it just for a fraction of a second. The storm woman's figure was no longer confined to the canvas. Her hands were pressing against the edges of the painting, as though she was trying to push through the surface, trying to escape. This can't be happening, Sarah thought. Her mind was reeling as she took a step back, but she couldn't look away. From the painting, the woman's face was now locked in a permanent expression of terror, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a scream that was only visible in the depths of the painting. The storm outside reached its peak, the thunder crashing in theater, shaking the walls of the apartment. And just as the sky erupted with another loud, bone-rattling crack of thunder, something else happened. The painting shifted. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the woman's body twisted, the storm in the background swirling with increasing intensity. The colors bled into one another, making it seem like the woman was moving, not just in a painting, but as though she was stepping out of the canvas with another flash of lightning. The air around Sarah became suffocating, thick with energy. She stumbled backward, her feet tripping over the rug as she tried to retreat. She reached for the door, but it felt like the very walls of their studio were closing in around her. The wind that had been howling outside now seemed to be inside the room, as if it had somehow entered the studio. The woman in the painting seemed to writhe in the wind, her form becoming more defined, her arms reaching out toward Sarah. The shadowy figures that had been faint in the background of the canvas were now visible, moving in the swirling storm behind the. They were no longer distant. They were closing in. No, no, no. Sarah's thoughts spiraled in panic. She turned, her hand gripping the doorknob, but the door wouldn't budge. She yanked harder, but it was as if the very walls were holding her prisoner. Inside the room reached its crescendo. The woman's eyes, those dark, pleading eyes, were locked onto Sarah. The painting wasn't just a representation anymore. It was alive, and it was calling to her, drawing her in. Suddenly, the woman's lips moved. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Help me." The voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't a whisper either. It was there, in the air, as if the voice was coming from deep within their painting, rising from the brushstrokes themselves. Her voice was full of pain, of something desperate, something begging for release. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what you want from me." The painting shifted again. The figures in the background now reaching out, their hands stretching beyond the frame, as if they, too, wanted to escape. The woman in the center stood with outstretched arms, now entirely out of the frame. Her fingers dug into the edges of the canvas, her body twisting unnaturally as she strained to break free. It felt as though the room was closing in, suffocating her with the weight of the unseen forces that now filled the air. The painting had somehow come to life. The storm outside echoed the chaos inside, and Sarah could feel the presence of something darker, something ancient slowly unraveling around her. A loud crash of thunder shook the room, and in the instant that followed, Sarah saw it. The figure of the woman, still suspended in the air, her fingers reaching for her. But this time, the woman's hand was reaching toward her, with a violent, screeching sound. The frame of the painting began to crack, and then everything went dark. The storm continued its violent assault against the city through the night. But inside Sarah's studio, everything was eerily still. The once wild winds had calmed, leaving a thick, uncomfortable silence that pressed against her ears. She sat in the center of the room, her eyes locked on the painting, still resting on the easel. The storm woman, now no longer confined to the canvas, had returned to her place within the frame. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. She could feel the pulse of something dark and restless within the painting, something that was far from finished. Sarah had barely slept, her mind a whirl of confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. She kept thinking about what she had witnessed, the woman's eyes moving, the storm that seemed to be alive, the voice begging for help. How had the happening come to life? Why was it changing? And why had she been drawn to it in the first place? The light from the early morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across their room, and Sarah stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting in one position for so long. The weight of the past few days hung over her, suffocating her. Thoughts she had to know the truth. She couldn't keep living in fear, not knowing what was happening. She had to understand the painting, its origin, and its connection to her. Sarah grabbed her coat and left the apartment. She knew where she had to go. The art store was quiet when she arrived, the door creaking slightly as she pushed it open. The air inside felt cold, despite the bright sunshine outside, and the same musty smell of old paper and paint filled her nostrils. The old man who had sold her the painting wasn't at the counter. Sarah's heart raced as she moved deeper into the store, feeling the presence of the store's forgotten history pressing in around her. "Hello," she called softly, but there was no response. The store was deserted, save for dusty shelves and faded canvases. She glanced around, her eyes settling on Thekina, where she had found It had been months since she had first walked into this place, but it still felt like yesterday. A voice interrupted her thoughts, and she turned quickly to see the old man standing at the back of the store, peering over a stack of paintings. His eyes glinted in the dim light, a knowing look in his gaze. He had been expecting her. "Ah, Sarah," he said, his voice as gravelly as she remembered. "I knew you'd come back." her breath caught in her throat as she approached him. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice trembling. She had never told him who she was. The old man smiled faintly, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "The painting chooses its owners," he said cryptically. "It calls to those it deems worthy or desperate enough to listen." Sarah frowned, confusion growing. "What do you mean? What's happening to the painting? Why is it changing? Why does it feel alive?" The old man's eyes darkened. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that," he muttered under his breath. "But you need to know the truth." He motioned for Sarah to follow him to the back of the store, where an old desk stood covered in yellowed papers and books. He picked up a worn notebook and handed it to Sarah. The cover was faded and cracked thepigit. "Brittle, this," he said, "was Victor Desmarais' journal." Sarah's fingers shook as she opened the notebook, her heart racing as she read the first page. "Victor Desmarais, 1892. She watches me, even as I paint. I feel her presence in the room, her eyes burning into the back of my neck. She is no longer the woman I once knew. She is something else. I can feel the change in her, as if the paint is what holds her soul together. I have tried to paint her likeness, to keep her here with me, but she is slipping away. I fear she will soon escape my grasp, and I will lose her completely. I must keep painting her, capturing her, until she is bound to the canvas. If I cannot, she will fade, lost to the storm." Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through the journal, her mind spinning with the implications of what she was reading. Desmarais had painted his wife, the woman in the portrait, but it was clear that there was something more at play here. This wasn't just a love story. It was something darker, something supernatural. Victor Desmarais wasn't just an artist, the old man said, his voice low. He was obsessed with his wife, Marie. After her sudden disappearance, he became convinced that her spirit was trapped somewhere he could reach, so he painted her over and over, hoping to capture her, hoping to bring her back. Sarah looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why is she changing? Why is it happening now?" The old man took a deep breath, his eyes heavy, with a mixture of sorrow and dread. Desmarais was desperate. His obsession grew darker as their years passed. The more he painted her, the more he believed he could pull her spirit into the canvas, bind her to it. The painting was meant to hold her, to trap her soul, but he underestimated the forces he was tampering with. Lurks he invoked didn't just capture her soul, it twisted it. And now, the storm, the figures, in the background, they are part of that curse. And when the painting changes, when it evolves, it's because she's breaking free. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You mean she's trying to escape?" The old man nodded slowly. "Yes, and she's not the only one. Others have tried to destroy the painting, to stop her from breaking free. But they failed. The storm you're witnessing, the storm that surrounds the painting, it's not just a reflection of her sorrow. It's the manifestation of something far worse." Sarah's heart pounded as she absorbed the weight of his words. "What do I do? How do I stop it?" The old man's gaze darkened. "The only way to stop her from breaking free, truly freeing her, is to destroy the painting. But the longer you wait, the stronger she becomes. If you don't act soon, she will be able to cross over into this world." Sarah felt a cold chill settle over her, as if the very room was growing colder by the second. The storm outside raged louder, and she felt it again, that eerie feeling that the painting was alive, that it was watching her, waiting for something. She didn't know if she could destroy it. How could she destroy something that had already claimed so much of her. "I have no choice, do I?" she whispered. The old man shook his head. "No. You have to act before she crosses over completely, before it's too late." Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a desperate need to understand what was happening. Their revelation from the old man about the storm, woman and Thekas, tied to Victor Desmarise's painting, only deepened the mystery and theta. She had known the painting was strange, that it had an unsettling presence, but she hadn't truly understood the extent of its power until now. The figure in the painting wasn't simply changing, it was evolving, becoming something more. As the days passed, Sarah tried to go about her life, but she couldn't shake the constant pull the painting had on her. It was as if the woman within the canvas was calling to her, reaching out with unseen fingers. The air in her apartment grew heavier, the atmosphere thicker with every passing day. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. Every time Sarah passed by the painting, she felt the weight of its gaze. The woman's eyes followed her, unblinking and relentless. At first, the subtle changes in the painting had been enough to unsettle her, the deepening of her eyes, the slight shift in her mouth, her outstretched hands. But now, things were becoming more dramatic. It started one evening when Sarah returned home late, exhausted from a long day of work. She was too tired to even think about the painting, but something felt different. The studio was cold, far colder than it should have been, and the dim light from the hallway seemed to flicker strangely. As she stepped into the room, she instinctively glanced at the easel, and there it was. The woman in the painting was no longer just standing there, her eyes sorrowful and distant. Now, she was moving, body shifting, her posture becoming more rigid, as if she was trying to break free from the canvas of the canvas. Her hands, which had once been clasped at her sides, were now reaching out, fingers stretched wide. Her expression, too, had morphed from sorrow to something else, something darker. Her lips parted slightly, not in a soft plea, but in a silent scream. The painting seemed to ripple with energy, as though it were no longer static, but alive. Sarah felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as she slowly walked toward the canvas. The figure in the painting, though still bound to the frame, seemed to be straining against it, the storm in the background raging with greater intensity, as though feeding off her transformation. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched. The woman's fingers inched closer to the frame. The shadows in the background, the once faint, almost unnoticeable figures, were now fully visible. They were figures of twisted, contorted shapes, their limbs long and unnaturally thin. Their faces were blurred, distorted, but there was an unmistakable sense of malevolent energy emanating from them. They were moving, too. The storm in the painting had become a violent vortex, twisting around the woman's form, as though it were drawing its power from her, feeding off her growing unrest. The figures behind her seemed to be pulling her toward them, their shadowy hands outstretched, reaching for her. It felt like the painting itself was alive, breathing, pulling Sarah into its world, into its nightmare. Is it possible for a painting to move? Sarah wondered, her mind reeling with the impossible. Her instincts screamed for her to turn away, to escape this nightmare before it consumed her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She stepped closer to the painting, her heart beat loud in her chest. The closer she got, the colder the room became, and the more the figures in the background seemed to press forward. It was as if the entire room had become the painting, and she was no longer safe in her own space. She was trapped within it, feeling the presence of the painting's supernatural force pulling her in. A violent crack of thunder echoed outside, and Sarah nearly jumped out of her skin. The woman in the painting moved again. This time, her entire body lurched forward, and the tips of her fingers brushed against the canvas. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a split second, Sarah swore she saw the woman's hand twitch, as though she had broken through just a little bit. The air around Sarah grew thick with energy. The storm outside intensified, its howling winds now matching the chaos in the painting. And as Sarah stood frozen before it, she felt the unmistakable sensation that the woman was looking at her at just a glance, but staring at her with deep, knowing eyes, as if they were connected in some way. She felt as though the figure was aware of her, of Sarah, that the painting had been waiting for her all along. Drawing her in, the room began to feel smaller, the walls closing in. The cold from the painting seeped into her skin, and she shivered uncontrollably. Her thoughts scattered, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She stepped back, but the storm in the painting followed her, the woman's eyes never leaving her. Suddenly, the room was filled with a loud, deafening, crashed, unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Sarah whirled around, startled. A jar of brushes that had been sitting on the nearby shelf had fallen, spilling paint across the floor. Her pulse was racing. She needed to get out of the room, away from the painting. She turned to flee, but then she stopped herself. The woman in the painting was no longer contained within the canvas. Her form had stretched further, as if part of her was breaking through into reality. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen. There was no escaping it now. The painting had progressed. The woman was no longer just a figure confined to the canvas. She was reaching out, and the shadowy figures in the background were closing in. The storm was no longer just in the painting, it was in the room with Sarah. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending, warping around the woman's form, and Sarah was caught in the storm. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Her hand reached toward the painting, almost of its own accord. The closer she got, the colder she felt, as if the painting was trying to pull her into its stormy world. And then, in the space between her fingers and the canvas, she felt Ita pulse, a surge of energy, like an electric current, coursing through her. She recoiled, stumbling backward, her heart thundering in her chest. In that moment, she realized the truth. The painting was more than just a painting. It was a doorway to something else. But what? Before she could answer, the door too. Her studio slammed open with a violent gust of wind, the storm outside howling louder, and the air around her became thick with tension. It had been days since Sarah's last encounter with the painting. The events from the previous evening still weighed heavily on her mind. She could no longer deny it. The storm woman had crossed some kind of boundary. The painting was no longer just a portrait. It was a living, breathing entity, capable of shifting and evolving in ways that defied all logic. The storm, too, had lingered for days, rattling her windows and howling through the streets like a force of nature in itself. Every time Sarah looked at the painting, she felt that same unsettling tension in the air, as if it were watching her, waiting for something. And as the hours dragged on, she realized that it wasn't just her imagination, it was real. The woman in the painting was no longer just a figure bound to the canvas. She was a presence, and she was moving closer. Sarah spent her days researching the painting and its history, desperately trying to make sense of what she had learned from the old man in the art store. Victor Desmarais, the artist who had painted the woman, had tried to bind his wife's spirit to the canvas, but it had gone horribly wrong. The more she read, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary painting. This was a cursed work, a supernatural force bound by paint and canvas. She had to get rid of it. But the thought of destroying the painting filled her with dread. Every part of her screamed that doing so might unleash something even darker, something worse than she could imagine. Yet the longer she kept the painting, the stronger its pull became. It was as if it were calling to her, forcing her to confront it, to finish whatever it had started. Her sleepless nights were growing more frequent, and Sarah was becoming consumed by the painting's eerie power. She'd barely slept in days, too afraid to close her eyes, too afraid to even leave the room. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was closing in on her, something that was waiting. Then, late one afternoon, a knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. Startled, she jumped up from her desk, where she had been staring blankly at the painting for the past hour. Who could be at the door? Her apartment was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. She hesitated for a moment before walking toward the door. When she opened it, she was met by a tall figure standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a dark coat, with a worn suitcase at his side. His face was obscured slightly by the brim of his hat, but Sarah immediately felt a strange chill run down her spine. There was something unsettling about him. "Good evening," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm looking for someone." No, you're not disturbing me," Sarah replied, her voice a little shaky. She found herself unable to look away from the man's cold, piercing eyes. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place where she had seen him before. "I was told you might be interested in something," he continued, his eyes flicking behind her into the apartment. His gaze lingered for a moment on the painting in the studio, but he didn't say anything about it. Instead, his lips curled into a tight smile. "It's about the painting you have." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the painting. How did he know? "Excuse me," she asked, her voice trembling now. "How do you know about it?" The man stepped forward slightly, his demeanor calm but insistent. "May I come in?" he asked, though it felt more like a statement than a request. There was something about his presence that made Sarah uneasy. But before she could react, he was already stepping inside, his gaze never leaving her. The door swung open wider as he entered the apartment, and Sarah stood frozen, her pulse quickening. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing toward the living room. His words were polite, almost too polite, but there was an edge to his tone that sent a chill down her spine. He moved with a quiet grace, his footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floor. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah stammered, but she couldn't keep the nervous house out of her voice. She hadn't told anyone about the painting, and yet this man seemed to know everything about it. "I'm sure you do," he said smoothly, sitting down on the couch. "The painting you've acquired is not just any painting, miss." He paused, as if waiting for her to fill in the blank. "Sarah," she answered, still standing by the door, her mind racing. "Ah, Sarah," he repeated, as though savoring her name. "You see, the painting you found, it has a history, and it's a history that you cannot escape." His words sent a cold shiver through her. "Escape? You know what it is, don't you?" he asked, his gaze now focused entirely on her. "You've felt it, haven't you? The pull, the changes?" Sarah nodded slowly, her throat dry. "Yes," she whispered. "I've seen it, the changes in the painting. The way it moves, it's alive. Something's happening." The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "You're not the first to be drawn to He said, and you won't be the last. He paused, letting the words sink in. You see, there's something you don't know about that painting. Something Victor Desmarais didn't understand when he created it. Something that has been hidden from you. That woman in the painting, she's not just a trapped spirit. She's part of something much older, much darker than you can possibly comprehend. Sarah's heart raced as the man's words sank in. She felt a strange sensation deep in her chest, like a growing sense of unease, as if she were on the brink of discovering something she wasn't prepared for. You've seen the figures behind her, the man continued. You've felt the storm within her. That's not just a painting, that's a portal, a door to something else. A door to what? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. To the other side. To Theplis, she's been trying to reach. And you, Sarah, are standing in her way. The silence in the room felt suffocating as Sarah tried to make sense of the man's words. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I can help you, Sarah, he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. I can show you how to stop it. How to close the door, but you must understand, you cannot just destroy the painting. You must destroy what it represents, what it has become. Sarah's mind was spinning, the weight of the man's words settling on her chest. She had thought the painting was just a curse, something that could be destroyed with fire, or perhaps left in the past, but this was more than just a haunted piece of art. It was a door, a portal to something else, something ancient, something dark. And now she had to choose. The man's visit left Sarah feeling unmoored, as if the ground beneath her had shifted and the reality she once knew had fractured into pieces. She couldn't escape that chill that had settled in her bones, nor could she shake the words he had spoken. You were standing in her way. Those words repeated in her mind, looping over and over. Sarah had no idea who this man was or how he knew so much, but there was no denying that truth in his eyes, intensity in his voice. The painting had changed, and it was no longer just an object. It was something powerful, something capable of bending reality. The figures in the background were no longer mere shadowy outlines, and the woman, the storm woman, was no longer trapped. In her world, she was moving, pulling Sarah closer into her chaos. And as much as Sarah wanted to deny it, she knew she was connected to this, tied to it by some invisible thread she couldn't understand. The man had warned Hirsch was standing in the way of something ancient, something that was waiting to break through. She had thought the solution was simple: destroy the painting, banish their spirit, and move on with her life. But that's not what he had told her. It wasn't that simple. She had thought the woman in the painting was simply a ghost, trapped in some eternal sorrow, but now it was clear. This wasn't just about a haunted image. It was about a door to something beyond, a power much older than anything Sarah had ever encountered. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The oppressive air in her apartment weighed on her, making it hard to think clearly. The storm had not yet stopped. The howling wind rattled the windows, and the clouds overhead threatened more chaos. It mirrored the chaos inside her. Unable to stay still. The tension was unbearable. She had to figure out what to do. The painting was alive. It was changing, and it was becoming real. It wasn't just some cursed object, it was a force, and she was Theon in its way. The next day, she found herself standing in front of the painting again. She didn't want to, but she knew she had no choice. The woman's eyes followed her, always watching, always waiting. The storm in the background was now more than just a reflection of some internal despair. It was a living, swirling maelstrom of shadow and wind, pulling Sarah in. The figures in the background had grown clearer. Now they were fully formed spectral, ghostly figures whose eyes gleamed with an eerie, unnatural glow. Their forms twisted in strange, unnatural positions. They were watching Sarah, too. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, and for a moment Sarah thought she could hear the faintest whispers' voices. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, but something rooted her in place. Something was pulling her, and she couldn't look away. She had to understand. She had to know why this was happening to her. Then, just as she was about to step closer to the painting, a sharp, piercing voice echoed in her mind. "Help me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was the woman's voice. It wasn't just the woman anymore. It was the voices of the figures behind her, calling out to her, urging her to do something, anything, to stop the storm. The storm outside intensified, the wind now howling louder than ever. Sarah clutched the edge of these all, her knuckles white. The air in the room felt charged with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder, and the figures in the painting began to move. The woman's hand, once reaching toward the edge of the now pushed against it, her fingers straining as though trying to break free from the boundaries of the frame. Sarah gasped as the painting began to shake. The canvas vibrated under her touch, and the air around it crackled with electricity. The shadows in the painting were no longer confined, they were spilling out into the room. The storm outside seemed to be feeding into the painting, and the figures were coming closer, their limbs stretching beyond the canvas, their forms distorting as they tried to escape. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. This isn't real. This isn't real. The thought was a mantra in her mind, but the room around her told a different story. The walls seemed to bend, the edges of the room warping. The atmosphere had changed. The space was becoming one with the painting. The figures were no longer just part of an image, they were here, in the room with her, closing in. Her breath quickened, and she grabbed her phone, frantic, trying to call anyone. The dialed tone seemed to echo endlessly, but no one picked up. She felt a surge of panic rising in her chest. The storm was now in the room, the wind howling with a terrifying force. Her phone screen flickered, then went dark. She tried to restart it, but their device was unresponsive. No, she looked back toward the painting, and her blood ran cold. The woman was no longer simply trapped in the portrait. She was half out of the canvas, her body emerging into the room. Her face twisted in silent agony, her fingers reaching toward Sarah with an unnerving intensity. The figures in the background had started to move. They were no longer just spectral shapes. They were becoming solid, reaching out toward her there. Features contorted in agony. The storm, too, was growing stronger, its winds tearing at the fabric of reality itself. "Help me, release me." The voices rang in her ears, louder and louder. They were no longer just a whisper in the background. They were demanding, pleading. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred, her legs giving way beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, unable to pull away. The painting was no longer just a work of art, it was alive, and it was consuming her. The room spun around her, and her senses were overwhelmed by the noise of the storm, the relentless winds, and those screams that echoed from the canvas. The woman in the painting stepped further out, her eyes locked onto Sarah's, no longer filled with sorrow, but with something far darker. She reached for Sarah. Everything went black. When Sarah opened her eyes again, the world around her was silent. too silent, too silent. The storm outside had faded, replaced by an eerie calm that seemed to seep into the very walls of her apartment. The air was thick with something she couldn't name, something heavy, as though time itself had slowed, and every moment stretched into infinity. She sat up slowly, her head throbbing with the aftereffects of whatever had just occurred. Her body felt cold, as if she had been frozen for hours. The chill in the air clung to her skin like a second layer of ice. She tried to push herself up from the floor, but her limbs felt weak and unsteady, as though the energy had been drained from her. Her mind was foggy, her thoughts jumbled, but there was one thing that stood out, like a beacon of dread in the fog of confusion. The painting. She turned her head slowly toward the easel, where the portrait of the storm woman stood. The room was still. No gust of wind rattled the windows, no unsettling voices whispered in her ears. But she felt the weight of the painting's presence in the room, its pull stronger than before. The canvas shimmered with an unnatural light. Sarah blinked, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was still seeing clearly. The woman in the painting, her face had changed again, but this time, the shift was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. It wasn't just the woman's expression, it was her entire form. Her lips, once a quiet line of sorrow, were now curled into an unsettling grin, sharp and wide, as if something dark had twisted her features into something monstrous. Her eyes were no longer filled with despair or fear. Instead, they were glowing, wide and piercing, with an intensity that burned through the very air around her. It felt like those eyes were reaching into Sarah's soul, pulling her in, pulling her closer, until she could no longer breathe. Sarah felt the world around her start to sway, as though the room itself was shifting, expanding, and contracting with each beat of her heart. She could hear the whispers again, faint at first, like the murmur of distant voices caught on the wind. But these were no longer gentle whispers. They were loud, frantic, and demanding. "Release me, you have to. Let me out." The woman's voice wasn't just a figment of Sarah's imagination. It was real. It was right here, filling the room with the terrifying promise of something breaking free. Sarah's pulse quickened. Her hands trembled as she reached for the painting, her fingers brushing the canvas. It was cold. Too cold. Ice cold, like the dead of winter. The air crackled with energy as Sarah's skin burned with the force of it, and she pulled her hand back instinctively. It wasn't just the temperature that scared her, it was their flinthessness that the painting was no longer just a piece of art, but a living force, a force that was manipulating her mind and body. The figure in the painting was no longer confined to the canvas. The boundaries between the real world and the painted world had completely dissolved, and then the painting began to move. At first, it was only a shift in the woman's posture, the movement of her arms, but soon her body began to bend and twist in unnatural ways. Her fingers stretched, her limbs elongated, as though the woman was breaking free, her form pulling and distorting in ways that no human body could. On the canvas rippled like water, and Thecola's blurred and bled into one another. Her figure no longer resembled a woman, it was something monstrous. A contorted figure of blackness and light dot. Sarah recoiled, her breath caught in her throat. The figures behind the woman's third arc, shadowy silhouettes, had also come to life. They were reaching toward her, their forms stretching beyond the painting. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were creatures, their eyes glowing, their twisted bodies crawling out from the depths of the canvas. The painting had become a portal, and it was opening. The wind returned, harsh and violent, whipping around the room, blowing papers and objects off the shelves. The temperature plummeted, and Sarah could hear the howling gusts of air outside, rattling the windows. But it wasn't just the storm anymore. The room was alive with the energy of the painting, of the thing that had been awakened. No, no, no. No, Sarah thought, her hands shaking, her body trembling. She couldn't move. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs were frozen in place, as if something invisible was holding her down. She could feel the weight of their presence in the room. The woman in the painting was reaching for her now. She could see it clearly, her fingers stretching out of the canvas, moving toward her like long, twisted claws. "Help me." The voice was louder now, more desperate. "Help me escape." Sarah felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, as though the woman's will was pressing against her. She gasped for air, her vision blurring, her mind clouding with a dizzying swirl of fear and confusion. She could feel the pull, as if the woman's energy was sucking the life out of her, draining her strength. The more she resisted, the stronger the pull became. The woman's fingers stretched further, breaking through the edges of the frame, her body shifting like liquid, twisting and reaching toward Sarah. She had no choice. She had to do something, anything, before the woman broke free completely. Destroy the painting. The words were clear now in Sarah's mind. It was the only way. The old man had warned her. She had to destroy the painting before it fully consumed her, before the woman could step into this world and unleash whatever darkness she carried. With every ounce of strength Sarah could muster, she staggered toward the painting, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch the canvas again. This time, there was no hesitation. She had to end it. As soon as her fingers made contact with the canvas, there was a violent jolt, a burst of cold energy that shot through her body. The room seemed to spin around her, the painting rippling violently, as though it was alive, trying to fight back. The figures in the background screamed silently, their forms contorting in the storm. Sarah stumbled back, her chest heaving, but she couldn't stop now. She grabbed the nearest objector, heavy brass candle stick and swung it at the frame, smashing their glass and splintering the wood. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, and the air crackled with energy as the room began to shake. The woman in the painting screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror or sorrow, it was a scream of pure, unfiltered rage. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a beast, but Sarah didn't stop. She struck the painting again and again until the was reduced to splinters, the canvas torn and ripped. As she swung the candlestick one last time, the force of it shattered the remaining pieces of the painting, and with a deafening crack, everything went still. The room fell silent. Sarah stood in the aftermath, her body trembling, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The storm outside had finally calmed, the winds now a mere whisper. She could hardly believe what had just happened. The painting thief at all was gone. The room was quiet, still, but Sarah knew, deep down, that it wasn't truly over. The darkness had been released, but it was only a matter of time before it found a way to return. As the last remnants of the painting crumbled into dust, Sarah looked at the empty easel and felt the weight of everything she had just experienced. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence that followed the destruction of the painting was deafening. Sarah stood in the center of her studio, surrounded by the broken shards of the canvas, the torn remnants scattered across the floor like the pieces of a shattered world. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps, her hands still trembling from the force of what she had just done. She couldn't believe it. The painting theftal to the other side was no more. The air around her, which had been thick with oppressive energy only moments before, had now settled into an unsettling stillness. But deep down, Sarah knew that the destruction of the painting didn't mean the end. It was just the beginning of something darker, something she was only beginning to comprehend. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the wreckage. The of the frame glistened in the dim light, and the remnants of the canvas were shredded beyond recognition. The storm outside had subsided, but the oppressive feeling in the room hadn't faded. It lingered in the corners, in the air, like an unspoken threat. Did I do enough? The thought gnawed at her mind as she bent down to collect the broken pieces. She was afraid. Afraid that, even in destroying the painting, she had inadvertently opened the door wider, letting something out, something worse than the woman, something that had been hidden in the dark corners of the painting for too long. Suddenly, she froze. There was a sound that was faint at first, like the soft scratching of fingernails against the floor. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She glanced around the room, her pulse quickening. She was alone, wasn't she? The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It wasn't just the remnants of the painting shifting, it was something else. Something moving in the dark. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sarah's breath came out in a visible cloud of mist. The storm outside may have calmed, but the storm within her studio was just beginning. She felt the air around her thicken, the pressure building in her chest. The figures, the ones that had been trapped behind the painting, were still there. She could feel their presence, like shadows lurking just outside her vision. She turned quickly, searching the room. She had to act. She had no idea how, but the urgency in her chest drove her forward. She couldn't afford to wait. Not now. You freed me, the voice came from behind her. Sarah spun around, her eyes wide with horror. The woman from the painting, the storm woman, stood there, but she wasn't trapped within the confines of the canvas anymore. She was fully out, her form twisting and writhing, her body made of shadow and storm. The figure was more grotesque than Sarah could have imagined, her features distorting as the woman's body shifted in unnatural ways. The once sorrowful face was now contorted into an expression of anger, of rage. The figure's body seemed to pulse with the storm, her form flickering between solid and the real. This wasn't over. The woman's eyes glowed with a dark, inhuman intensity. Her hands, those same hands Sarah had seen stretching toward her, reached out again, but this time, they were real. Real fingers, stretching toward Sarah, claws of shadow and light. You freed me, and now I'm free to do what I must. The room seemed to bend with thepua emanating from the storm woman. Sarah's breath quickened as she stumbled back, her back hitting Thruel behind her. The painting had been destroyed, but something worse had been unleashed. The woman was no longer just a figure in a portrait. She was real, and she was here. Her body flickered between solid and shadow, her features shifting as if she was being pulled between two worlds, between the painting and the real world. Sarah's mind raced, but there was no time to think. The storm within the woman raged, a tornado of dark energy swirling around her, filling the room with an unbearable pressure. Sarah could feel her strength waning, her body growing colder, as though the woman's presence was draining her life force, pulling thievery energy from the air around them. "I won't let you escape again," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking but filled with determination. The woman's lips curled into a cruel, twisted smile. She didn't speak. Instead, her hand reached out, and with one swift motion, she sent a blast of wind crashing towards Sarah. The force of it knocked Sarah off her feet, sending her sprawling onto their floor. She gasped for breath as the woman's form loomed over her, now fully manifested, her eyes glowing with fury. "This is what I've released," Sarah realized, her chest tightening with fear. A force that was never meant to cross over, something far worse than just a trapped soul. The room seemed to be closing in, the edges of her vision blurring. The storm inside the woman grew louder, her body flickering between solid and smoke. The shadows that had once been a part of the painting now moved with life, stretching towards Sarah, wrapping around her limbs like chains. They were pulling her in, suffocating her. "You freed me," the woman whispered, her voice low and cold, "and now you will pay for it." In that moment, Sarah realized what she had to do. The woman, this creature of storm and shadow, was tied to the painting, two thyrses that had been born out of Desmarais's obsession. She had to undo it. She had to unmake what had been made. She had to close the door she had opened. Sarah's mind flashed back to their journal she had read, to the old man's warning. Desmarais had bound his wife's soul to the painting, trying to keep her trapped, but in doing so, he had unleashed something that could never be contained. The painting had become a portal, a doorway between worlds, but it could be sealed again, if only she could find a way. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah reached for the remains of the painting on the floor. Threatened canvas, the shattered frame there had to be something she could use, something to bind the woman. Back to the painting, please let this work. She grabbed a shard of the broken frame and held it in her trembling hand. She didn't know what would happen if she used it, but she had no other choice. The woman's form was growing more solid, more powerful. The storm was reaching its peak, and Sarah could feel herself weakening, her body succumbing to the of the woman's presence as the woman stepped closer. Her hand outstretched, Sarah plunged the shard of wood into the air in front of her. A bright flash of light exploded from the shard, momentarily blinding Sarah. The room shook. The walls rattled, the air thick with the energy of the storm. And then, with a violent, deafening crack, everything went still. For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. Her eyes were closed, her body trembling from the exertion. When she opened them again, she found herself lying on the floor. Alone, the woman, the storm woman, was gone. The silence that enveloped Sarah's studio was suffocating. The storm outside had finally ceased, leaving behind a stillness that felt both serene and ominous. The wind that had once howled through her apartment was gone, replaced by a quiet that settled over everything like a thick blanket. Sarah lay on their floor, staring up at the cracked ceiling, her body exhausted, her mind numb. The remnants of the painting lay scattered across the room, shattered glass, torn canvas, and broken wood. The woman, the storm woman, was gone, her dark presence erased from the room as if she had never existed at all. But Sarah knew better. The destruction of the painting hadn't just erased the woman, it hadn't undone Thickers entirely. The damage was done. Thorold had been touched by something that was never meant to be touched, and there would be consequences for that. The air felt different now, lighter in some ways, but heavier in others. She had succeeded in sealing the entity away, but something had changed. She could still feel it in her bones, in the way the room seemed to vibrate with a subtle, lingering energy. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been bent, twisted by the forces she had unleashed. She forced herself to sit up, her body aching from the strain of the confrontation. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but it remained unresponsive. The screen still cracked from earlier when she had tried to call for help. Her thoughts were scattered, fragmented by the sheer weight of everything that had happened. She had thought destroying the painting would bring an end to it all. But as she looked around their room, she realized that this was only the beginning. The world she had known, her normal life, was gone. It had been replaced by something darker, something that could never be fully undone. The sense of unease settled in her chest again, the quiet stretching longer, deeper. As Sarah rose to her feet, she stumbled slightly, her legs weak. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where the remnants of the painting still lay in pieces. She thought she had seen Thelest of the woman who had tormented her, but a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that the painting's power wasn't gone. Her heart skipped a beat. A sound, a faint scraping sound from the corner of the room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The remnants of the canvas shifted just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to send a chill down her spine. The pieces of the painting were moving. No, she whispered, her voice shaking. No, this can't be happening. But the pieces moved again, more definitively this time, as if something was trying to come through. The painting wasn't fully destroyed. Her mind raced as she realized that despite her best efforts, she had only severed the surface of thirst. The painting, or whatever was tied to it, wasn't gone. It was still here, embedded in the room, in the very air. Panic surged through her, but she fought it down. She couldn't lose control now. She had to find a way to finish this, to end it. Once and for all, Sarah backed away from their shifting pieces, but her mind was spinning. She needed to do something. She needed answers. The old man's cryptic warnings about the painting had never fully prepared her for what she was facing. But now, she was trapped in the aftermath of the curse, and the only way to move forward was to confront it head-on. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second feeling like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. That night, Sarah found herself in the same place she had started, in front of the remnants of the painting. She couldn't escape it. It had become part of her world now, a constant reminder of the darkness she had unknowingly invited into her life. The room felt different now. There was an oppressive energy in the air, a lingering presence that had settled into the very walls. The painting, or what remained of it, was no longer just an object. It was a force, and Sarah realized that she couldn't simply run from it. She had to understand it. Days passed, and Sarah tried everything she could think of to find a solution. She visited every library, scoured every resource she could find, hoping to uncover something, anything that could help her rid herself of the painting's curse. But every answer led her in circles. The deeper she dug, the more lost she felt. Then, one night, after hours of research, she found it, a passage in an ancient book, buried among the shelves of a small library she had visited on a whim. It spoke of curses tied to objects, ancient paintings, sculptures, and other artifacts that were bound to spirits, trapped within them, unable to escape. The book described methods of breaking such curses, but they were not simple, and they were not guaranteed. The most important detail, however, caught Sarah's attention. To truly break the curse, one must undo the bindings that hold it, sever the connection between the spirit and the object, and re-establish the balance of energy that was disturbed when the object was created. Re-establish the balance. The words rang in her mind as she processed their meaning. It wasn't enough to destroy the painting. She had to confront whatever had created it, Thephus, that had bound the woman to the canvas in the first place. She had to find a way to set things right, to fix the distortion caused by Victor Desmarais's obsession. She wasn't sure how to do this, but she had no other choice. The remnants of the painting were still in the room, still alive in some way, and they weren't going to let her forget. She had to act. It was then that Sarah made a decision. She gathered the pieces of the painting, the broken fragments that had once held the woman's image. They were still pulsing with a strange energy, faint but undeniable. With the remnants in hand, she prepared for what she feared would be the final confrontation, the final attempt to set things right, to undo the damage done by her actions, to finally close the door she had opened. But as she stepped toward the center of the room, a cold gust of wind swept through the apartment, rattling the windows and sending a shiver down her spine. The storm had returned. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. Thank you for watching the painting that changed overnight. What started as a simple discovery turned into a terrifying journey through a world where the lines between the real and the supernatural are blurred beyond recognition. Sarah's struggle isn't just about breaking a curse, it's about confronting the darker forces that hide within, the things we think we understand. But the story doesn't end here. The woman trapped in the painting may be gone, but the shadows still linger, and the true horror of what was unleashed might still be waiting. If you've enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to ring the bell so you never miss the next story, where reality and the unknown collide once again. Until then, remember, sometimes the art we create can be more dangerous than we could ever imagine. Good night, sleep well.